Well, good morning, everybody. Larry Wilson here with the SafeConnection Expert Panel Series. This is the last in the second series of four, and we're going to be talking about balancing just culture and accountability in the real world. How do you make it fair? And for those of you who are just joining us, as I said, this is the fourth in the second expert panel series. And I'm going to introduce our guest panelists in just a second, but they've been with us through this series of four, also the previous series of four. So we started way back with complacency and COVID. It's not over till it's over. And I'm sure every one of us would agree it's not over yet, although at least thankfully there's a bit of light at the end of the tunnel. That said, we went from in the little town I live in, 10,000 people, we went from 14 yesterday to 63 today. So obviously things going very badly in the wrong direction in my little neck of the woods. And for those of you listening, hopefully it's going a little better wherever you are. We then moved into leading indicators. What would make you change? The next one was zero harm. Should you have zero harm in your mission statement or safety policy? And then the last one in the first series was felt leadership. And are they feeling it? In other words, can you actually get that all the way down to the shop floor? And we even pursued a bit about, could you actually get it out to the contractors and to the contractor level? So that was very interesting. And from there, starting in October, we tackled, I guess, one of the most serious concerns these days: serious injuries and fatalities. And the first one was recordable injuries versus serious injuries. Why have only recordable injuries come down, and the serious injuries and fatalities sort of stubbornly remaining where they've been in the workplaces for the last 10, 20 years, actually. So we took from there, and then we went and looked at excellent safety equals excellent business performance. Yes, everybody agrees. But is it cause or is it just correlation? And then from there, we moved into old workers and young workers and effective strategies for those two high risk groups. And if you didn't join us for that one, everybody, for over 30 years, over 50% of the accidental workplace fatalities have been to people over 55 years old. And if you think about the one before, cause versus correlation, you can't say just being old causes workplace fatalities. But the correlation, as I said, has been incredibly powerful and significant for over 30 years. So we looked at some effective strategies for dealing with the old folks and the young guys. And I remember, when I got into the business 30 years ago, having somebody in the oil patch saying that to me: Larry, young guys get hurt more than the old guys, but it's the old guys that die. So we've been tackling some pretty, if you will, persistent problems in health and safety. And now we're moving into the last one here, and potentially the most controversial, certainly in terms of topics near and dear to my heart. I've been listening to, evaluating people's judgments on this topic for years. So let me read the title in the blurb, everybody. It's a little long, but it'll sort of set the stage for the breadth and the depth of this show. And then I'll introduce the panelists and we'll get right into it. But human error is preventable in almost every instance, but it is also inevitable with enough people or enough time. Everybody makes mistakes. On the other hand, people need to be held accountable for their actions whether they are premeditated or spontaneous. And making sure this balance is perceived as fair and just is a challenge. In some cases, a huge challenge, especially if the balance has not been perceived as fair and just in the past. So to help overcome these challenges, many companies have adopted the concept of having 6 to 10 life-saving rules or golden rules that have a zero tolerance component to them. Does this work in the real world? So we're going to find that out from the panelists. Did it reduce their serious injuries and fatalities or not? Now, some of the folks that we've got on, ladies and gentlemen, they work for very big companies, but they also have excellent safety performance. So, you did something, a positive intervention, but you were already at 0 fatalities. It's hard to say that it improved that statistic or that number, obviously. You can't get better than 0. But it doesn't mean that you didn't do a whole lot of good in terms of preventing the next one. So, with that caveat, we'll find out from them whether that, having the life-saving rules worked in the real world. In addition, many companies I've worked with anyhow have a kind of 3 strikes and you're out approach. But what if it's an innocent mistake versus a deliberate violation? And if it's primarily human error, like a fall on a stairway, is it okay to hold the managers accountable for the results? Should the managers only be held accountable for proactive efforts and things they can control? Perhaps, but then someone eventually has to be accountable for picking a process that works. And having that kind of expertise at a local plant level isn't cost effective. Unfortunately, having accountability at anything other than at the local plant level has been problematic. And as a result, very few corporations mandate what safety initiatives over and above legal compliance the individual plant sites will do. They leave that up to them. You guys will probably like this part, but they do give advice, help, nudge, push, pull, and plead. Please note you're not allowed to scratch, bite, or pull hair or use a cattle prod, but short of that, almost any other technique to get people to work more safely seems to be appropriate. But anyhow, how does that all work? The glorified please, push, pull, all the rest of it. What challenges does that approach have? Last thing, certainly, and all of you can comment on this, can a corporate governance committee with a C-level member help in terms of getting a safety initiative or improvement process to the whole company? Anyhow, many questions, and hopefully what everybody's gleaning from this, me especially, not a lot of easy answers. So let me just start with the expert panel and introduce everybody. It's on my screen, top left, is Alex Carnival. Now, Alex just recently became the CEO for Dynacast. It's a company that's international. I think Alex told me, North America, Europe, and Asia. I can't remember if it's about South America and Latin America, Alex. Over $1 billion in revenue. But previously to that, and how I got to know Alex really well, he was the Chief Performance Officer at eTex, another global company building materials, building products. Again, all over the world, and he's the Chief Performance Officer there. So we got to work a lot together with the implementation of SafeStart, different places around the world. But Alex and I also piloted a performance, a performance product and refined it at one of his plants in Ireland. So yeah, thanks again, Alex, for joining us. And Alex is also going to be my next guest on Larry Wilson Live coming up. I should have the date right here. February the 11th at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And we're going to be talking about basically taking the learnings from safety and why is it so difficult to get those successes, some of them hard, we learn the hard way, and get those things through the rest of the company and the departments in the organization. Is it just the silos or is it a little deeper than that? So hopefully you can join us all for that. To my top right-hand corner on my screen is David Bianco. David is the Director of Health, Safety, Environment for Epiroc. Epiroc is another global company. Everywhere there is mining, there will be people from Epiroc. They may not always have a manufacturing assembly operation in that country, but they will have service technicians. If there is underground or surface mining, there'll be somebody there. Now, David and I have also worked on the global implementations. He's helped us produce various training programs with one of his sites in Garland, Texas. And he's been on the expert panels with us all along, as well as David was my very first guest on Larry Wilson Live. So David, again, thank you very much for joining us. And I will get that Queen album cover on your wall before all said and done. I was on an album cover for Queen back in my Hollywood days. And then last but certainly not least, Peter Petroni. Peter Petroni was the Corporate Health and Safety Director for American Electric. Does the S stand for systems? Everybody just calls it AES, Peter. Is it American Electric Systems? Is that what the S stands for?
The acronym doesn't stand for anything anymore, Larry. It's just AES.
Okay, well, there you go. But anyhow, and they are also, maybe not as global, more North America, South America.
It's actually a global company, Larry.
It is now? Okay. Just last night, I was introducing somebody from Murugappa Group. When I first started working with them 4 years ago, it was 36,000 employees. I got corrected last night. They're 51,000 now, like in less than 4 years. So you do have to keep up. Holy smokes. Anyhow, gentlemen, I am this topic, like I said, I started off over 30 years ago, kind of coming under the DuPont philosophy, and a great deal of their success with safety management they attributed to some very stringent accountability standards. But then years later, I got to actually work with the DuPont company implementing SafeStart all across North America. And, I guess not too surprisingly, you got to see a bit of the back end of that heavy-handed accountability and some of the workarounds, if you will. And so I wasn't nearly as big a fan after all that, to be sure. But David, let me start with you. I gave everybody a bit of an elevator speech about Epiroc, but you could fill in any of the blanks, and then just sort of so we could get everybody's cards on the table for a couple minutes, maybe just talk about your perspective, what you think about this in terms of, accountability, just culture, and achieving that fair balance. But I don't necessarily want you to go into a lot of depth about the life-saving rules and stuff just yet. But if you feel like it, you can go out on a limb and say what you think the executives you work with, what their perspective is on all of this as well. And then I'll move on to Alex and Peter, and then we'll start getting into a bit more depth with everybody. But so you just, I kind of know, having known you for a long time, David, on your feelings on this, but the people watching don't. So you might have to go back a bit further than just you and I go here, and kind of take everybody from the beginning.
Sure. Thanks, Larry, for the invitation, and my colleagues, great to be with you again. One correction I do want to make is I'm not a director.
Okay, sorry.
I am a manager of safety, health, environment, and quality for a large division within Epiroc, surface mining division. So I don't want to steal anybody else's title. We actually don't use that title, but thanks for having me. You know, this is a really close topic to my heart, as you were saying, and we're a Swedish company. We previously were owned by an American company. And when I go into more depth, I'm going to talk a little bit about the differences in this regard, because I think they were pretty profound as we experience them. But it is something that we tackle with in a lot of ways, whether it's on the factory floor or even you know, within the white collar thing. It's same kind of principles apply. But obviously, when you're dealing with health and safety, especially you know now with health and COVID, which has brought on totally new challenges in this regard. Who's coming into the facility? Are they really, you know, thinking about what their personal situation is when they walk in? Should they have come in that day? All of these kind of things have now really risen to the surface as well. So it's very high on our minds.
You've got a very touchy issue on your hands these days. That
Yeah.
I mean, if we could, whether you're, I mean, I don't know if you're comfortable about getting into it. It's just after this first round, David. But you know, I'm kind of glad I'm not you, I guess, for this particular topic and that particular issue.
Sure.
But we'll definitely move into it.
Okay.
Yeah. So what do you think your executives think though about all of this, David? You know, are they do they think more accountability? Do they think that's not the right direction in general?
I think it's just accountability. And in other words, a lot of times these things bring out issues where you really don't have good policies or good definitions or things that really you can say, you know, we've made our full and best effort to make this clear or done these things. So we also need to make sure that we have the basis for coming to those kind of conclusions. And it's not that it should be a last resort, and it's not that it should be a first resort. It should be the resort we need in the context of what happened and the risk, and also what the company has done to promote and make clear whatever the expectations are. So there's a real balance. And I think sometimes the management, you know, we reflect back and say, you know, that could be clearer. There's just too much open area there. So I think it does cause reflection, and it does cause that, as opposed to reflexing into overreaction.
Yeah, I mean it's very very well said. The difficulty I think with the balance in a lot of people is that it's easy if you get far enough up. It's easy to think, oh, we just do more of this, right? Because you really just don't see all of it. You might get a short-term win, or it might look like that, but you perhaps have thrown the baby out with the bathwater, kind of thing as well too. Anyhow, Alex, let me just sort of move on to you. You made another interesting comment before the show too about the, you know, if you will, the accountability within the peer group. So I'm not sure how. I just want you to include it. I'm not sure how, again, because I thought it was really interesting. But
Sure.
again, what do you, in general, you know, do they think more accountability is going to help, less accountability? And start maybe with your own sort of personal view on it a bit, if you want.
Yeah, I mean, I think you know the blurb you put out there was a big one, right? And there was an awful lot to unpack for sure. So I wanted to make a few comments around it there. One thing that jumps out to me is, especially when you're talking about this topic, it's much bigger than a safety topic. And that's one of the things that I think a lot of leaders can fall into a trap. Whether you're talking about harsh accountability or more open or building trust, I think you ultimately have to have a coherency with what your overall leadership approach and your leadership philosophy is. Because if you're leading one way on everything else, if you're leading on manufacturing or production or quality or anything else, and then you're taking a completely different approach and you're saying we have zero tolerance and we're going to fire you if you make a mistake, there's actually a fundamental disconnect or incoherency that I think will not lead to a great place. The way I view it,
in other disciplines, you're encouraging people to take risks, to be innovative,
right?
To move the business forward, and you've challenged them with that, saying, hey, if we don't innovate, we don't take risks, we're going to die. And then on the other hand, but we've got a zero tolerance for any safety violations over here. I agree with you. That just seems very inconsistent or, contradictory.
Yeah, and so when you get into even the premise of balancing something, balancing just culture and accountability, if you've got an inconsistency to start with, it will never feel balanced to the people, right? I think the only way you can find the balance and I think actually coherency or consistency to me is even a better word than balance, because I think in a certain way, if you're leading in a collaborative way, in a cooperative way, in a way where you're giving feedback and giving consistent context, just culture and accountability go together. And the comment I made about accountability before the session was that it's actually a big word. And some people consider accountability a manager forcing people to stick to the rules and having harsh consequences if you don't. That's the compliance accountability. That's, we have rules and you need to stick with them, right? There's another kind of accountability, which is people being accountable to themselves and to each other and to the business, and feeling that as a true value. And that ultimately, I think, gets you to a much better place. So the way I view, I'm not a fan of zero tolerance.
For instance, Alex, sorry, everybody, but Alex and I are both basketball players. We could have been in the NBA, but anyhow, but there's accountability to the coach, right? There's accountability to the team. But for me, I always felt a bit more accountability to my teammates, in a way. So that's kind of, I think, what you're getting at, right? There's
no, and it's a good parallel, because what I would say is that, holding a very strong compliance accountability can get you to a certain place. And if you're in a very bad spot, if people are breaking rules and people are walking across, Latoto lines and are violating things that are pretty egregious, you probably need to do that. You need to sort of set that as a very strict, very clear, very unbreakable set of rules, just to get to, over the hurdle of these very egregious things. But I think the point is that only gets you so far. So the equivalent in basketball is a coach does that. A coach drills into his players, do it this way, run the layup this way, run your offense this way. That will get you better. That will make you an average team in your conference. But the teams that win it are the teams that actually don't even need the coach on the floor. They've been coached up and they actually work together, and they know what to do in any given situation, not because the coach is telling them or not because it was written on the blackboard before the game, but because they understand what they're doing, what the goals are, and what they should do in any given situation. And for me, and that's the ultimate, that's going from compliance to engagement, and really getting the people involved with it. So to me, that's the ultimate target. And, I won't say that you have to, sometimes as a manager, you need to be very directive, you need to be very strong, but I think that's more applicable when you really have, things that are much more out of control and chaotic versus, that's the first 80%. The last 20% is the harder part and the more the slog work, which is that.
But I think part of the illusion too is that at the beginning, when you're working on that 80%, if you take a hard-nosed approach with it, you will see improvement and you will see it fairly quickly. So you got a fair bit of reinforcement for that decision. What you don't necessarily see is that it's got a limitation, and you keep pushing on that lever, you don't get any further. And Peter, sorry for again, I'm going to start with you next time, Peter, because we always are supposed to just get our cards on the table and then we kind of get into it again. So again, same question, Peter. Start off with, your own personal perspective on it, and then, the people you've worked with, your peers at AES, and also, now you're getting to work with lots of managers, plant managers, and senior, superintendents and production managers and stuff, with SafeStart engagement. So, what's the feeling out there about accountability, Peter? More, should we have more? Should we have less? And maybe just start with yourself, where you sort of thought about it from your position at AES.
Sure, Larry. And I'm going to go back to something that David said and then kind of swing around to what Alex said. It's really kind of hard after going behind two smart guys like this. But, from my perspective, I really kind of started thinking about this years ago when I was in the military, Larry, about this, kind of just accountability. And some of the things that I've learned that I've applied throughout my career and kind of shared philosophies with other executives that I've worked with is that, people want to feel secure when they come to work. They want to make sure that, they understand what the expectations are, have the resources to be successful, and understand what the consequences are going to be if they're, deviate one way or the other from those expectations. And it comes to some of the things that I learned when I was in the military is you have to be very clear about what the expectations are, and that's something that an organization isn't always good at. We may come up with golden rules, like you said, but are those golden rules really clear? I've seen golden rules, for example, don't deviate from the lockout tagout standard, for example. Then when you read the lockout tagout standard, there's some ambiguous language there. People might not really understand or might not be able to follow those because of that. Another thing that I've found throughout my career is that sometimes there are hidden rules within an organization. Sometimes the rules and the culture kind of conflict. And Alex was alluding to this. We know that we're supposed to lock out a piece of equipment before we enter it, but we know that operators might fix a jam in a machine without locking and tagging it, and not only get away with it or may even be praised for it because they're keeping the line moving, taking that little bit of risk as you alluded to. So as leaders, we have to make sure that the culture and the rules are kind of aligned, and that's not always the case. So, just to kind of boil it down, if a leader is good at articulating what the expectations are, if he stays close enough to make sure that the people have the resources, the knowledge, and the other things that they need to be successful, then that accountability piece or that feedback piece on the end comes a lot easier, I believe, from my experience.
Mm-hmm.
Larry, can I expand on that? Because I think it's an absolutely great point, because I think a lot of people view accountability as the last action you take, right? That somebody's violated or somebody's done something and you take a decision to bring a consequence. And the reality is, the accountability really should be all the work you do before that, which is everything that Peter just talked about, bringing clarity on what the expectations are, giving feedback all along the way, having a measurement system, for whatever you're doing. And that is definitely a leadership failure point, because that's leadership's responsibility to make sure all of that is in place. And if it is, then the accountability should flow, because everything's been laid out, the expectations are clear, and the feedback loop is clear. And so that's actually what I think frustrates a lot of people on the factory floor, is they're being held, quote unquote, accountable, and there's ambiguities or there's inconsistencies, exactly to what Peter was talking about. And so I think it's go ahead, Peter.
I was just going to say, if I could expand on that, I'm sorry for interrupting, but we've all seen examples where an operator or a mechanic has kind of cut those corners to get the production going, and as long as he doesn't get hurt, we're good, right? We move forward, and that's almost a reward, informal reward for taking that shortcut. But as soon as somebody does get hurt, especially if it's a serious injury, then we start talking about sanctioning. And that's that, you know, inconsistency that you were talking about.
Double standard.
We have to be savvy enough as leaders to, you know, just have that simple approach, articulate the expectations and stick to them, right?
And that's what we have to understand, is that if it's happening and as leaders we don't correct it, we've sanctioned that behavior.
Exactly.
We've signed off on it happening again, whether we think we have or not. And
Gary talked about this a bit in our first book, you know, Inside Out, where, you know, just by being even just a little bit lazy as a manager can get you into trouble. That he talked about a job that they had. He had it planned out for, I think, it's been a while, but I think it was like something 3 weeks worth of work. It was at height, and I think it was getting rid of a bunch of insulation and repacking it. I'm not sure about asbestos or not, but the long and the short of it was they got this job done in half the time, and the superintendent was delighted and wanted to give these guys a bit of a bonus, or, you know, a certificate for dinner at a nice restaurant and stuff like that for getting the job done and all the rest of it. And Gary kind of went back and, you know, he looked at, because he's the one who planned the job out. And then he went out and he talked to these guys and he said, how in the heck did you get that scaffolding set up, taken down in this amount of time? And they said, oh, we didn't use scaffolding, we used ladders. They were like 40 feet up in the air on ladders, not scaffolding. I mean, so that's how they got the job done. But, you know, without even a little bit of effort, like he said, it didn't take him more than like 10 minutes. They could have been reinforcing some very unsafe behavior that they didn't mean to do, just because they didn't bother looking into it, right? You know, like, you couldn't have got that done if you had shored the trench. The only way it could have got done this afternoon is if you didn't shore the trench, you just cut it, worked in it, laid the pipe, and then filled it in. You know, so there's a bit of that stuff too, right? That you kind of know that maybe a shortcut was taken, but you just didn't want to bother investigating it because you got the result you wanted. I think that's crept in here and there for sure, but I wouldn't think that's the main issue. I think the main issue is that you've got, in my opinion, you got a lot of managers that think we're just not taking a hard enough line with these people. And I think, well, the deterrent should always be the injury. I mean, maybe we're just not explaining or educating that, or, you know, we're not getting people to see how the complacency is affecting them over time, because this is inherently motivating, not losing an arm or losing a leg or you know, something worse, right? So I think there's always, from an accountability point of view, that I'm the one who's going to get hurt. I'm supremely accountable for my injuries. So why any extra discipline would be fair philosophically is potentially a valid question from some people. But it's also a valid question philosophically in terms of, you know, since they are ultimately accountable, why can't we frame that education in a motivating enough manner? But anyhow, Alex, let's or David rather, let's get back to you, and maybe a bit of the depth background, any stories you want, the journey. You know, I know, like you said, bit disrupted by the sale, and you were going to explain a bit of how that sort of changed at the upper echelon. But I mean, I've definitely been to Garland, and you know, I think you've achieved the balance. Like, I think the people think it's fair there, fair and just. I mean, I don't think the people are unhappy at all. The culture is really good. It's positive. So, I don't know if you could tell us how you did it. Do you have the maybe just start off with, do you have the life-saving rules and go from there?
Well, you were talking about the sale, and I'll go back to when Atlas
Okay.
Copco bought us in 2004. We're Epiroc now, which was a spinoff of Atlas Copco. So we went from being owned by a large U.S. corporation, which I won't mention, but and they had a lot more of those hardline kind of reactions of things when something would happen. And usually it didn't come from the middle managers, it just came from the norms of HR process or whatever. So those things were kind of the indoctrination. That really changed a lot, being owned by a Swedish company in terms of values and human evaluation of what things happen. So, with the story you just told about, a leader maybe saying something like, why isn't that situation causing a write-up or causing a response? I always ask the question, maybe that leader was paying attention to overlooking that all those years. And in fact, there's a lot of times when, as we said earlier, silence is acceptance, letting things go on. So we really need to understand the root of the problem, and that's the hard work. It's easy to take an action and then say, we're going to do X. But what really is there is what's going on overt? Is the person purposely trying to do something? Is it covert that they're trying to get it done, but it's because they think it's going to help the company or make things easier? Or is it just human? They forgot to put their mask up over their nose, and you just got to remind them. And so I think that whole thing to me is the hard work that you have to do. And so in the middle of the pandemic here, and having people come into the facility, we struggle with this just simply in a questionnaire, asking questions of people before they come in the building.
Mhm.
And there's a lot, and there are instances where we have had something occur where it's pretty clear that the response on that questionnaire wasn't accurate. So we have to look at what drove that, what caused that, and sometimes we're finding it's people saying, hey, if I answer that, I'm not going to be able to go into work, I'm not going to get paid. So there are drivers. So you have to, we really have to understand.
Which actually isn't even true in your case, is it? They are going to get paid, right?
Well, in the U.S., you get paid up to 80 hours. So by the government support. So if you've already had it and got that, then technically the government won't back that. Now, if you haven't had it at all, then yeah, you have that. But you have to communicate that, make sure people know what that is. You have that bank available. Some people don't hear the news, care to watch the news, don't even know what PPP is. So you have to make sure people realize it. And then you got to decide, are you going to go over and above that if someone does have it happen multiple times? Because it can happen in a larger family, happen multiple times, even just getting self-quarantine. So these are the kind of things, but the principle really, when it comes to all these things that I basically have said, we really need to think this way and just say, if you do the right thing, we'll do the right thing. And that mirrors both ways when you think about it. The employee to the company to the employee. Because otherwise there's fear that the right thing won't be done and I'm going to be harmed by it. Whether it's the company being harmed by someone coming in that shouldn't, or the employee being harmed because they're not getting paid. So it's really important, I think, that is the perspective. And you could take that same thinking to safety on the floor. It's the same principle. And I think that value, that accountability, because accountability works both ways. It isn't a one-way thing. It isn't just at the worker. The company has to have accountability too. And as Peter said earlier, and Alex, if you don't have things defined well enough or correct enough or strongly enough as you think you do, you're probably making a lot of presumptions about what people understand and think about what it is you think is policy. And then the tribal policies, or the policies that people know themselves because they've been there 30 years, those are really tricky because they know them. Half the people know them, third of the people, it's not universal. So that
Yeah.
definition and understanding and validation, you know, do you understand? Do you accept that? Do you have any questions? What's your feedback? Because otherwise we're presuming that everybody's on the same playing field, and that often is not true.
Well, no, and it's
And I
like,
think Larry, I
go
think
ahead.
we're getting really into the heart of the matter here, you know, because we've all sort of said it in a little different way, but it's this really driving to a solid understanding, not just of what the expectations or the rules are, but the why they're out there, you know, and because
Mhm.
you can tell people the rules, don't do this, don't violate that, don't go in there. But the point I think that David made and that Peter made is that if somebody understands the why, if they understand that this is because we think this will cause severe injury or this is causing an unacceptable risk, you know, and that's really understood, then it starts to become coherent and starts to become consistent, which is really my big push. That when you have consistency and coherency, and then I think the third part being a true understanding of the why, then you've sort of built this natural alignment between the quote unquote just culture and holding everybody, including leadership, accountable. So leadership has an accountability to react on these because we've laid it out very clearly that these are the rules, these are the guidelines, et cetera. And if leadership doesn't react consistently, then we're causing the disconnect or the imbalance, if you will.
Yeah, because the employees are going to say it doesn't matter. It can't matter. They're not doing anything about it. So therefore, it propagates itself.
Yeah, and there's a part that I think really is important as well. Is there's a lot of times when you've got different people that work in a factory. You have different people with different risk profiles, right? So you've got the one mechanic who wants to take all the shortcuts and wants to work faster and get the extra 10 minutes per hour on the break, and you've got the other one whose personality is to do everything extremely precisely and extremely correctly and all of this. And if one is working one way and one is working the other way, whatever your rules are, and you sort of allow that and not resolve it, then you've got a built-in inconsistency. It's going to be bad because one way or the other, you know, they're pointing at him, he's pointing at him. And so it's important as leadership, try to identify the open gaps or the inconsistencies and not leave them open, you know?
Well, yes, and also, and certainly, like you said, the why is important too, because if there's, I don't know how to say this in a politically correct manner, but it, like for instance, you can't hear on the tarmac, you know, on the ramp, right, the airport, so you got to talk on the radio. But the difference from a safety point of view, talking on the radio versus talking on your phone isn't significant. You know, it's the same thing, right? You're talking on the radio, talking on your phone in terms of the risk, but one's allowed and one isn't, right? And so, you know, you can easily see the people going, well, this is stupid. So then they just start talking on the phone, and pretty soon now you've got people moving planes around talking to their girlfriend on the cell phone, right? Which is not going to happen on the company radio. And then he drives right into the wing of a parked plane. So you like with COVID here in Vancouver, they closed all the theaters down. So now all of the theaters have been turned into sports bars, and they play basketball games and football games on the big screen, and they make everybody sit 6 feet apart and serve them hamburgers and French fries and club sandwiches in their theater chairs because they can't be open for a theater, but they can be open to watch sports events. So obviously there's another very, you know, and you'd think, fair enough, the hazards are fairly objective, right? So, you know, there really shouldn't be ambiguity because the hazard isn't ambiguous. You know, like in your case, Peter, you know, the electricity is pretty much an equal opportunity employer. If you're between it and the ground, right, it could care less, right? So, you know, whether your rules are consistent or whether your policy is clear or fair, that part about the electricity going to ground is pretty much going to happen every time, right? So you'd think, especially in the electrical industry, but it would be easier to be black and white. And yet my experience was that it was even more difficult to be, like in terms of, like you were saying, the military kind of approach. I don't, well, I'll let you comment on it, but if you took that military approach out to linemen, for instance, do you think you'd have a disaster on your hands?
Well, don't misunderstand when I was talking about the military approach. I think that there is just accountability in the military.
Oh yeah, no, I know, but
things are clear, and sometimes the sanctions may be hard, but they're very, not very often are they unexpected, because people know what the consequences are going to be if they're clear about the rules. I think where this starts to get muddy, Larry, is how leaders communicate. For example, going back to the old school type leadership, some of those old school leaders didn't really understand that communication was two parts, right? You have the transmission and the receiving, right? And it was more geared towards the transmission, and it sounded good in my head, so he must have understood what I said, right? Which is not always the case. And since Dr. Watt is not here, I'll tell you a kind of a funny anecdote about that. Shortly after I got out of the Army, I started my family. I was taking my daughter to dance class. I had my favorite cup in the cup holder in my car, and I had gone to work that morning, and I realized that there was about a quarter of a cup of cold coffee in that cup. It was my favorite cup that I took every day to work. And so what I wanted was my daughter to take the content of that cup and dump it out the window of the car so it didn't spill inside the car. But what I told her to do was, hey, Elena, will you throw this out the window? So what do you think she did? Cup and all went out the window, right? And it's kind of a funny story. And then that goes to this, how do you react to that, right? Because reacting and responding is an important leadership characteristic. Now, I could have reacted to that and got angry with her, but as I thought through it, it was really my fault. I didn't give her clear instructions about what I wanted, and she did exactly what I told her to do. We often do that at work as well, especially when we rush and when we get, we need to get things done in a hurry. As leaders, we sometimes articulate expectations that are clear to us, but didn't get received. So in the military, those of the folks on the phone or on the panel that were in the military know that if something's mission critical or life critical, you ask the person to repeat it back to you to make sure that they understood exactly. And it's worth that extra little bit of time to make sure that the expectations are clear before you take that next step.
I was actually impressed that they implemented that at Starbucks.
Yeah.
This three, say back communication. I mean, it's such a simple tool.
And then if I could just say one more thing about the sanctions, Larry. One of the things, or one of the tenets that I've kind of always gone by is that, and you talked about the 3 strikes and you're out. But kind of 2 things I look at when I'm number one, it's rare that an individual should make that decision. Some of the best practices I've seen have committees that kind of get together and talk about what the sanction could be, and those, I think, come to a more just conclusion or more just decision when there's more people involved to talk about it. But we kind of always go by 2 tenets. If a person either willingly goes against the mission critical rules, then you need to start talking about some harsh sanctions. Or if the person doesn't have the aptitude to do it. And it's not for improving your safety record, it's really a kindness to that person and their family. Because if they don't have the will to do what they know is the right thing to do, it's not fair to them, their family, or their colleagues to have them working in a high risk environment. And if the person doesn't have the aptitude to do the right thing or work in a safe manner, it's kind of the same thing. It's a kindness to him, kindness to his family, kindness to his coworkers, that he's not put in that situation where he's likely to fail because he either doesn't want to do what's right or can't do what's right.
Well, yeah,
Can I
you
give,
get the guy,
can I give
getting
an
the guy
add-on?
who's under 6 feet tall to play post. It never works. It never works, Peter. Um,
Sorry, Larry,
go
can I give
ahead.
a quick add-on to that?
Yeah.
Because you just clicked on something with me. One of the things that I think we don't do enough of as leaders is after some type of a sanction is taken and decided, and and Pete went through the process you can go through to do that. I think it's actually important, if you, as much as you can, to communicate to the rest of the organization what was taken and why, right? Because people will make up stories. Joe was fired, for this, or he wasn't sanctioned for this. And I think it's very powerful, important to explain what you think happened, what went wrong, and why you took the action you took, including, even just the things that Peter said. Because again, one of the big downsides of the whole accountability and sanctioning is the message it gives to the rest of the organization, whether you're too harsh or whether you're not harsh enough. It's very important for that.
Well, Alex, and that
All
brings up
conclusions,
another
we
really,
don't get involved in those conversations, Alex. You're exactly right.
but it's also another important thing we should try to get to. But I do want to hear just from each of you about the life-saving rules and to comment on it one way or another, good, bad, indifferent. But sort of part of what some of the folks watching might want to know is, if they're thinking about should we or shouldn't we have life-saving rules, did it help, did it work? I agree that there's so much more to this topic than just picking the 8 or picking the 10 rules for your facility that make the most sense. There's so much more behind it than all that. But let's just go to that surface level. David, do you guys have life-saving rules? And is it a 0 tolerance? Is it a 3 strikes and you're out? You don't have to get into the whole legalese part of it at all.
Sure.
Just the big picture, yes or no. And
Yeah, well, we're definitely a zero harm kind of a focus, and we have safety commitments that we have within the structure of the organization. So those are things that are guideposts as well as our extended values. So we have those in place. I think the thing that I want to comment on before I don't lose it here was Alex's comment a second ago. I agree totally that I've used this analogy just as a visual to say, yeah, if someone loses a job over something that's very overtly known, and we need to understand why this happened, that needs to be pasted up where people see it and know it. And I think there's a conflict with HR organizations about this.
Okay.
you're not allowed to tell people why you fired somebody.
Right. So
Privacy
there's
laws.
a very
There are.
right.
There's
Yes. So it's a difficult thing, but you can do it in a way that is a little more neutered in the approach of how you do it. But the point is, I agree that the value of that is an untapped thing that just, to me, I believe that everybody knows, but they need confirmation. In other words, if you want to change behavior, people have to realize there's value in changing behavior. And in order to do that, they have to have some guidepost in order to do that. And that's a component of it. So you can simply say, what do you think, when they say, why did that happen? What do you think?
Okay.
So I mean, you can turn it around.
The deterrent component of discipline and accountability is a huge part of it all, right? Like, in other words, you're trying to dissuade somebody from working at heights without a fall arrest harness because of, what happened to the last person in terms of, they're not working here anymore versus what happened to the last person as they fell and died, right? But that, again, in order for the deterrent to work for you, all of that has to be perceived as fair on the part of the workplace, or else it'll go exactly the opposite against you, right? So, I think you opened up a real, I don't want to say a can of worms there, Alex, but, it's a big part of of what we're trying to, in other words, we're going to hang you
Well,
from the
well,
tallest tree so people can see you there, right?
well, Larry, now that I've been invited on Larry Wilson Live, I'm looking to ultimately get invited on Larry Wilson After Dark. I think that's my goal.
Well, I mean, like I said, I've had these conversations one-on-ones with CEOs before about you could potentially hold people accountable for deliberate decisions, especially on a repeated basis with multiple coaching attempts. But when it's an error, holding people accountable for the error is likely going to get you nothing more than improved cover up in the long run.
Look, let me provoke even a little more, because the simple truth is a pure zero tolerance policy is actually the easy way out from a leadership standpoint, right? Because
Sure.
I mean, so it doesn't get you all the way you want to get to. The hard work as a leader is actually making rational, consistent, fact-based decisions, in a way that can bring coherency to your organization, taking the situation into account. And I'll try to give you an example of what I mean. You asked about the life-saving rules, and at ETEX, I implemented life-saving rules, on 6 or 8 major processes, the typical ones. But the goal there was less so about accountability and more so about trying to bring really good clarity on what we were expecting and what we were looking for. That was the mission. So when we're talking about Latoto, or we're talking about working at heights, et cetera, that we had a really common definition and that people had a lot of clarity. We wrote it in a way that said violation of these, will bring sanctions up to and including potential dismissal, right? So we didn't say violate this and you're fired. We said these are serious, we want to do it this way, and the consequence can be very severe, right? And then it's exactly to what you said. If something happened, as leaders, we had to look, was it egregious? Was it this guy violated it every day and he finally got caught, in which case he's probably getting fired? Or was it something that was a confluence of errors, and this guy was he's a great role model in the rest of the world, and take that body of work into account and have enough leadership confidence to be able to explain it to the organization either way, which is much harder and more work than actually doing it from zero tolerance. And it matters regionally. We were much, much stricter in Nigeria, for example. There it was black and white because it was a real issue. So you took the local cultures into account, and try to do it, but we tried to give ourselves enough openness to make rational decisions.
Okay. Peter, did you guys have life-saving rules, golden rules, or something like that? 6 to 10 of them set aside as being particularly important for people that may or may not have had additional or special sanctions. So, you know what I mean, like golden rules.
We did
right?
have golden rules, Larry, but they were implemented. I could only restate what Alex and David had said. They weren't for, if you do this, then don't come to work tomorrow. It was more of a avenue to identify what the high risk activities were, what the big risks were at work, and give a construct for leaders to discuss those either during, pre-job safety analyses and other forums to understand and manage those risks. So it wasn't a, violate this and you're going to get fired. It was more of a opportunity to have those discussions, as Alex pointed out. And then one thing I would add that I've worked with in organizations that have a safety principle that, kind of paraphrased as working here is a condition of employment. I've seen this in, various variations of places that I've worked.
Working safely is a condition of employment.
And I think we've all heard this before, but again, it wasn't, when people first hear this, they think, oh, if I don't work safely, then I can't work here. And it's not really what it meant, but it's really kind of a good, from my perspective, a good principle to have, because it just opens up that opportunity for leaders to talk about how important it is, not just to work safely to prevent injuries, but to prevent property damage, to get the proper quality of whatever we're manufacturing, and do it in an efficient, effective manner. So it's not the not the punishment or sanctioning aspects of it. It's just kind of a philosophy that we work safely here, if you will.
Well, I think credit where credit's due. Working safely is a condition of employment. I first heard that from DuPont. I think they probably, in their 12 principles were sort of the first to come out with that, maybe, or publicize it. But I kind of, just to come back to what Alex was saying before, when I first went to companies and got presented for the first time with life-saving rules or golden rules that were special, like it was set aside from the other visitor requirement things, if you will. And what I liked about it was the focus. I mean, to kind of what you're saying, Alex, you're saying, look, we've got whatever it might be, 500 safety rules in total here at this whole refinery or this railroad complex. But here are 6 life-saving rules, and we can give, from a training attention point of view, some special focus and highlight on these things for everybody, simply by letting everybody know that we think these are the most important. I almost thought that a bit of the importance message got eroded with the potential discipline component that went in there. In other words, as soon as you start talking discipline, that's what people want to know about and get that clear, versus the why, as you were all saying, the why we have this rule, like in the first place, and really sort of sticking that in their head about, how important it is not to walk between rail cars when, because they could move, or the lockout, tag out, the fall arrest, the lower explosive limit for the confined space entry, all of those kind of life-saving things. The why behind them is more important than the discipline that will happen afterwards. So I like the life-saving rules, but I think they lost some of their value by making them, like when they said golden, like, in other words, you break this and you're fired kind of thing, as opposed to you break this and you're dead. That was just a bit of my feeling on it. Would you recommend, like, if companies didn't have those life-saving rules, would you, I mean, obviously you did it, Alex, so you'd probably recommend it, but would you recommend it with any sort of specific cautions that you'd throw out to the people?
Well, again, I do it purposefully and try to understand what you're trying to accomplish by doing it. And for me, it was to try to bring a really consistent view and understanding of these, because what we found out, even through near miss analysis and serious event analysis, is that there was differing understandings of some of these fundamentals about what it meant, what you needed to, because you can put things in procedures. You can say you need to tie off if you're going to go walk on a roof, but whether it happens or not is more if people understand it. If people understand, I'm walking on a roof and I could fall through, that's a real thing that can happen. Then you're gonna take the precaution, not because it's in a rule book or whatever else. So it was those kinds of things to try to make sure people understood for these things, how serious they can be, and exactly why we were doing what we were doing. So.
And that's why we've taken the statement safety by choice, not by chance. So people recognize they need to make those decisions in big and small ways in order to make the right decision, so that they don't just hope that luck is going to protect them.
Oh, goodness, there's, and I mean, I'm just going to quickly ask you, Peter. I mean, like, I mentioned it in the intro description, but it's maybe we could just come back to, like, this is such a deep topic. I mean, the one thing I mentioned before, should managers actually be held accountable for proactive efforts? I mean, we've now talked about, managers being held accountable for results, like the injuries in their area of responsibility. But, what about the whole arena of being, responsible and fired for, fired for not doing inspections, fired for not doing observations or engagement contacts with employees, for not holding safety meetings. I mean, it's not too much of that. Supervisors that get fired for not being able to manage production or quality happen daily, but not necessarily, the management of the safety, especially the proactive activities, holding people accountable for that, especially at a first line supervisor level, is a very questionable thing in a lot of companies, big problem. For Peter, any final comments? Just we've got to close out. We're over time again, and Wada did suggest this. He said, Larry, there's 60 minutes with these folks. It's just everybody's. You should go longer, because there's more to talk about, I think. But we are over here, so I'll just get some closing comments from all of you, and then I'll wrap up. But Peter, I'll start with you. I guess kind of what, like,
I guess
you
just to address
you guys had golden rules, right? So would you recommend them?
Yep,
And
I do.
And then what one or two cautionary things if somebody was going to do it? Alex said, first of all, make sure you got the right ones, and then make sure the people know the why behind it. I'd agree. Those are the most important too. I don't know if there's anything else left for you though.
I think that, what I wanted to do is address what you were saying about leaders being accountable for proactive measures. And I think that, just to reiterate what we've been talking about, if those proactive measures are carefully thought out, they're tied to your strategic goals, I don't think you ever have to talk about the sanctioning, because most leaders are savvy enough to know that if they do those proactive measures, whether they're inspections or safety contacts or cert cards, whatever we're talking about, we're doing them for the right reason, doing them to achieve a strategic goal. I don't think you ever have to get to the point where you're talking about sanctioning folks for that. They're going to do it because they know what they have to do. They're going to know how to do it and know why they're doing it. So I think that's how I'd wrap it up, Larry.
Yeah, well, no, I agree with you too. And I also am on sort of my own view on this for people's safety is that, if you feel like you're pushing the water uphill versus just trying to, move the water going downhill in a slightly different direction, as soon as you start thinking you're trying to push the water uphill, you got to stop, because it's not going to work, right? And you kind of got to look at accountability and safety as a bit of, I think you've got to get the water running downhill and recognize that you can divert it a bit, right? But like if you're pushing it uphill, you've got to stop and basically regroup and retrench and say, wait a minute, this will never work. We will never be able to beat the people into this if this isn't. This has got to happen a lot more willingly, I guess is what I'm saying. If you try to make it force everything, especially with safety, you're going to end up losing it. What about you, David? Do you want to have any final comments for the folks there?
Yeah, the only thing I was thinking is I think there needs to be more dialogue with the workers relative to what drives the overt or covert behavior that does occur. There's often a reason, and it can be built into the process. It can be built into a fault in the product or in the system. And I think there's a lot of jewels and valuable nuggets of information that are out there that we just don't have a free and open enough dialogue with them in order to capture that, so that we aren't trying to push something uphill. We're trying to understand what's driving the situations that are happening. Because at the end of the day, if we don't do that, they're going to continue to happen because of complacency and habits. So I really think that is, and again, it's like that hard work, investigating why something happened. But on the front end, preventively, having that dialogue. Why is this an issue? Where does it become a problem? when we do risk assessments, looking at the human aspect of those risk assessments. These are the things that are going to provide us the intelligence, and I mean that by information, that is going to drive better situations so that employees aren't put in those, decisions where they have to make the wrong decision. And then that we have that we can objectively say, hey, we know this is being done because it isn't because the system isn't defined. It isn't because we didn't do our best. It's because someone is making a choice. Then we have something we can grab onto.
No, but in the most recent case that you were talking about in terms of the COVID, what came to mind with me was that you throw out a 97 or a 98% number, most people naturally think that's pretty good. But it means 2 or 3 people out of 100 didn't quite understand the policy or the communication, and hence could be very susceptible to making a bad decision. And in this case, a decision that affects more than just their own safety, because they can get other people sick, right? So, you think you're good.
Absolutely.
I mean, let's face it, nobody can communicate perfectly with everybody, especially when you've got, English second language issues here and there, but that's the reality of, if you're going to turn around now and try to hold those people accountable when they didn't really understand in the first place, you can't, right?
It's hard to do.
Yeah, well, in clear conscience, it's hard to do as well, too. And it might not be perceived as fair, which means as soon as you're not fair, your whole deterrent value has gone just the opposite. In other words, you're the bad guys now, and this guy's the martyr, which is
And
the
we
last thing.
we can't presume worse demons. In other words, if people, if there's 1% of the people that would abuse it, let them abuse it, because that making the right call for 99% plus is what you need to do. You can't make your decisions based on fear that someone might abuse a policy, because if you do, then you could shut your plant down for that decision, and then you're going to realize what it really costs.
Oh, guys, I know, Alex, I'm going to ask you just to wrap it up, but I would love to come back and do another show with you guys about, if we get into the proactive accountability part, because I mean, that may actually be, one of the very central gear, drive mechanisms right there. If we could talk about that, because I agree, if you get the proactive stuff right, you won't have likely any, one of the things that's very interesting that we did years ago, when it was more supervisory observation processes, and everybody's worried about the discipline component. And what we found when we surveyed the employees was they thought it was very common for people at this facility to be disciplined for safety infractions. And then the next question underneath it was, have you ever been disciplined for a safety infraction? And you had almost 100% of the people saying that it happened all the time, but you definitively had 100% of the people saying it's never happened to them. And you kind of like, where did this much smoke come from with absolutely no fire? So the deterrent value is exaggerated over and above the reality in almost every place, in almost every facility I've been in, right? And yet you get this balance wrong, and I have seen morale I've seen places that were humming, like 0 injuries, 2 years, suggestion box crammed full, go to nothing because of one unfair disciplinary reaction based on an observation. Like the whole thing went out the window. And then get this, the plant manager phones me up and he says, Larry, I know you told us not to do this, but the corporate lawyers were saying that we had to have some disciplinary records for lockout, tagout, or we were going to be going up the creek without a paddle. So we listened to the lawyers instead of you. And now nobody wants to make any observations. Our recordable injury rates going through the roof. corporate's threatening me with my job anyhow. I was wondering if you could come back and fix it up. And I'm like, I can just wait till I get in there in front of the room. I mean, I'll be able to hear the bullets just getting loaded into the chamber. Here's the guy who talked us into all this. Well, I mean, you know, it's sort of like I said, Percy, I said, it's like you had an affair with your wife and you want me to come over and have dinner and smooth it over with her, even though I was the one that introduced you to the new woman. I mean, no, I'm not coming over for dinner. I don't want to do this, you know? I mean, so the whole idea of accountability is a complicated, it's definitely complicated. As I said, near and dear to my heart. So I'd really like it if you guys could come back and we could talk about that proactive component, because I don't think we really got at it. And Alex, any last words as we close out? Or
it is complicated, but I'll try my best to really summarize it succinctly based on what all of us have said. Maybe this can be a chapter for your book. I think the accountability comes down to the 3 C's: consistency, coherency, and communication. I mean, I think you have to be consistent in your approach and actually consistent with your overall leadership approach. You shouldn't be managing safety or exceptions different than you manage everything else. And a lot of places do. So that should be one question. Coherency in the sense of, does it make sense? And do people understand the why behind it? Okay. Is it a coherent set of rules? And then the communication, just like David and Peter have been talking about, that we are communicating before events happen and after sanctions happen. And so people understand the why. Do those 3 things and do them well. I think you've got the team that's actually self-correcting itself, you know, and you're reducing the inconsistencies.
Yeah, very good. I agree. And it's also a brilliant segue into the show with you, Alex, because that was sort of one of the things we were talking about, is that, you know, in terms of some of the difficulties of taking lessons learned in safety and also tremendous successes in terms of human factors and reducing critical errors and getting those through the rest of the company. But one of the examples that Alex and I were talking about was the facility I was at. They shipped 3 truckloads, 150 skids of product to their best customer instead of their second best customer that actually ordered it. And we were talking about what would happen after the fact if that happened versus the fork truck operator backed the fork truck off of the loading dock and was seriously hurt or killed. And, you know, if there was a serious injury, the root cause investigation, the need to look at the system and look for engineering controls, perhaps, you know, something we could do with the lock gate so that this kind of a thing could never happen again. But the guy who just ships the 3 truckloads of stuff to the second best customer, if he or she had already made that mistake, something that significant the week before, and they'd made a mistake that significant 3 weeks before that, do you think there's going to be an investigation? Or do you think the person's rap sheet and priors are all going to come to bear? If the person hadn't made a mistake like this for 10 years, that's likely going to go a lot better. But it's going to be mostly about the person, not about the system. And yet with the injuries, we've learned that you don't want to just focus on the person. You want to look at the whole system as well, too. But there's been a great deal of difficulty getting all of that through to the other departments. So, you know, are they just silos? Is that the only problem? Or is it, as we'll likely find out with Alex, a fair bit deeper than that, you know? So hopefully you can all join us. That is February the 11th. 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern time. And gentlemen, again, thank you very much for your time on this. We'll get word out to all of you, everybody, probably 3 or maybe 4 weeks. We'll check everybody's schedule and calendar, but we'll get the message out to you, and we'll have at least one more show about the proactive component of accountability and safety. And you know, is this really the missing piece or the missing link that we need to be focusing on? Don't want to sensationalize it, but personally, I think it's a really big key factor. So again, thanks very much, everybody. Thanks everybody for listening. And
Thanks,
Take
Alex.
care.
Bye,
Stay
David.
see you
safe.
next
Good
time.
seeing you guys.
Take care, Alex. See
Alex,
you.
I'll see you soon on the show. Okay. Bye-bye,
Okay, we'll
everybody.
do.
Bye.
Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye. See you.